Welcome to Ethics Shorts. Whether you're a seasoned professional, a student embarking on your counseling journey, or simply curious about the ethical dimensions of mental health, this podcast is for you. Our hosts will unravel ethical quandaries, explore real-life scenarios, and discover the gray areas that shape our profession. This podcast is sponsored by the Arkansas Counseling Association. The views expressed in the content belong to the content creators and not the organization, its affiliates, or employees. Let's talk about ethics.
Just want to say welcome to everybody back to another episode of Ethics Shorts. I'm Michael Jones, and I'm one of the members of the Arkansas Counseling Association Ethics Committee member.
I'm Helen Jennings Hood, and I am co-chair of the Ethics Committee for ARCA.
All right. So today we're going to go and stay in the topic of ethics, but we're going to go a little bit different direction today and talk about ethical decision-making models. As we think about ethics in general and talk about the process of trying to make a decision whenever we find ourselves in the counseling room, ACA, and there's several that are out there where have provided these ethical decision-making models to help us to be able to walk through and know what do we do when a situation arises and we're not sure exactly what direction to go in. And so I know in working with students and also working with supervisees, that's always been a really important part of the process is for them to at least have an understanding of why they're making the decision they're making so that they're able to justify the importance of what maybe to justify why they're going through this process the way they are. And so the ethical decision-making models are really helpful for us to have that guideline to know exactly what kind of where to go. But the interesting part about ethical decision-making is that everybody's going to do it a little bit different. And so we're going to kind of walk through some of that today to see how, even when we have two therapists here talking about ethics, how we will go through the exact same case, but using the same model, but how the decision making could be a little bit different. So, Helen, like in your experience, as a student and as a practitioner, how I guess for you, how have you implemented with this when you talk about the decision making model? How's that been best implemented, I guess, in your practice so far?
I think I see the decision making model as kind of like a tool to use along with the ACA Code of Ethics, because when you're first introduced to the Code of Ethics, one of the biggest, I guess, sticking points in learning in the beginning is that it's so famously gray. Nothing's black and white, and that there are different kind of, aspirational ethics and mandatory ethics and all these kind of things. And so I think it's kind of hard to wrap your mind around when you're in grad school, going out into practice and getting your license and everything like that. So I think being able to see this ethical decision-making model as a tool to help you in particular situations that are relevant to your practice and your relationships and your experiences really helps us kind of, muddle through some of the gray areas of the code and utilize them the way that we need them to work for our practice, because they're there to guide us. That's the whole point, right? And so this allows us to apply them and allow them to be our guide rails in different situations.
And I like how you use the term "your" throughout that explanation over and over again, because this is definitely an individualized process that hopefully we all are going through, so that if there was ever a question about, hey, why I did something, I can literally go to the decision-making model and say, when I was making this decision, this is what was going through my head. And so I think that's helpful, especially for as new therapists as they're trying to practice ethically, to do this over and over again to become a natural process. And then it's not a thing where we're having to figure out things. It's just, it's become natural part of what we do as clinicians. And so I'm looking forward today kind of working through a case with you and kind of see how we both think about it, because I'm hoping we're not on the same page about it, and see what we would kind of do about that. All right, so I'm going to share a case with everybody, and we're just going to talk through it, and then we're going to apply the ethical decision-making model to it and kind of see how this goes. And so for this example, we're just going to talk a little bit about private practice and talk about no-show fees and things of that nature, just for a practical example. So here's a case. A 54-year-old cisgender white female reveals in her intake that she has cystic fibrosis, and as a result has frequent hospitalizations and doctor visits. She no-showed for her third and fourth session, and you discover that it was due to her needing to rush to the doctor for one of the no-shows. For the other, she states she forgot, but was also sick in bed. Both as a business owner and a counselor, how do you handle this? How do you feel about no-show fees and enforcing them? So this is our case. We have there's a situation where someone has a medical issue. They missed 2 counseling sessions, and we've got to figure out as a clinician and a business owner, do we charge them a no-show fee? So for us to make a decision, let's go to our ethical decision-making model. And the first bullet point for the ACA ethical decision-making model is to identify the problem. So Helen, we'll just kind of start talking about it. So what, at least from your perspective, what are some of the issues that are coming up in this case study, and we're going to figure out what the problem is?
A couple of problems that I see, I think, are communication. Has the clinician communicated with the client about no-shows and about how that process works? Because, we need to be transparent and talk with our clients upfront during intake when we first meet with them about how that looks. They need to be able to have that documentation that they can look up and see what's going on. So did we do that with our client? If we did, then they are not following the agreement that we had. So that is also a communication problem. So is the communication problem for the clinician, or is it coming from the client? And we don't have that information here. So we can assume on one hand that it's from the client because they are missing for valid reasons, but they're not communicating with the counselor or the clinician. So that's one element of the problem.
Gotcha. And yeah, so I can definitely see the communication being an issue. And as I think about this case, I wonder about the informed consent that the clinician used, whether or not that has been verbalized or written down anywhere about what is my policy for no-shows, or if you have illness, how does that affect the counseling relationship and you coming together? So definitely a couple of different things here. Communication definitely could be an issue here. Also, like you said, well, the informed consent could possibly be an issue too. I'm also just wondering about, how another part is, I guess, identifying the issue, even taking the communication a little bit deeper. I'm wondering too, if this is a situation that is recurring a lot with this clinician. So is this a recurring issue that that they always have clients who don't show up, and if they talked about the health issues in general? So to me, that would be something else I would be kind of popping around in my head. It's like, how often does this client work with this clinician work with people with health issues, and is that something they've thought about when thinking about their no-show policy, and if that has been verbalized? So to me, so I think that there's a couple of different problems for sure that pop up for this.
Well, then I think, that kind of leads us into, it goes back to like the policy itself. You need to have consistency. If you start making, inconsistent decisions about applying no-show fees, then are they fair? Are they, are you really following your own policy? If you're not upholding your own policy, then how are you making those decisions? Is that a personal decision, or is it, finding out if it's a valid excuse for missing? What does that look like? So you can dig a little deeper and to see if this is, like you said, like a clinical issue with the clinician, or if this is a client issue.
Gotcha. And I think about, if we're thinking specifically about the Code of Ethics, I know the Code of Ethics does talk about, how we deal with our clients. And so obviously this is definitely an ethical issue that we're trying to figure out here. But it's like, once again, what's the right move to go forward with? And so just trying to figure it out. And so the second part of the code tells us that we need to apply the ACA Code of Ethics. So as we're kind of thinking through this, and I don't have the exact codes in front of me, but I'll make sure I provide those. I know the code does talk to us about, we wouldn't start in the preamble and looking at some of the basic parts of the code. It talks about, just the ability for clients to have freedom and for them to be able to make decisions themselves. And so I think that's one thing as I'm thinking about applying the code, I wanted to think about that. It's like, okay, what freedoms does a client have in this process to be able, when it comes to their health? And so is missing a session a freedom that the client has the ability to have or not? And I think that's one thing I think I kind of think about some. And also one or two, when it comes to the Code of Ethics, what's the responsibility for the clinician here when it comes to when we talk about being fair with the client and how they handle the client? How do we provide equity in these situations? And so, to me, I think that's the code will speak to that part of it as well.
I think that kind of circles us around to like beneficence and doing no harm. So, if this is going to be a financial burden for the client when they have all these health issues and appointments and emergency visits and things like that, maybe that's not something that's going to be good for them, and maybe it would even hurt them. So that gets into, not hurting the client and doing what's best for the client, and making sure that we're following those values in the preamble of the Code of Ethics to make sure that we are not only being fair and equitable, but we're not doing any harm, and we're doing what's best for the client.
So, and I guess what I'm hearing you say is like, when we look at the preamble and we see those principles are based there, to me, it's like, regardless of what the code is saying, we still want to base our decision. Our decision needs to be affected by what the preamble says. So, like, I like how you put that, with beneficence and everything, autonomy, all those different things. We want to make sure we're still using that as a core of what we're doing as we're trying to apply what the code is. So yeah, I like how to me, that's why I really do enjoy the preamble a lot, because it for me, it helps bring some clarity to situations that are definitely gray, and it helps you go kind of, at least for me, brings me back to center and look at it. So, okay, the code doesn't specifically talk about this, but what is the heart of some of these things that the code is saying? So I do like that the preamble brings us back there. So we got applying the Code of Ethics, and then number 3 is determine the nature and dimensions of the dilemma. So where do we start with this one? So we've determined there's going to be some communication issues here. We see that there could potentially be some harm that could happen to the client. So how do we determine, as number 3 says, the nature and the dimensions of this dilemma?
So we have the valid reason for missing, for no showing, feeling ill, not being able to function throughout the day, and an emergency visit with the doctor. So those are, I would consider those very valid reasons for not coming to therapy. So the problem comes back to, the communication about it, because, you've had a client not show up 2 times in a row. They've also disclosed to you that they have this, serious chronic illness. So, of course, you're worried about them, and maybe they're not responding. So it comes back to, can we communicate? Because you need to be able to communicate with your client, and they need to be able to communicate with you to build that rapport. You need to be, make sure that you're on the same page about things, given that this person has had circumstances outside of their control. Maybe, thinking about how could this look in the future? Thinking about possibly having a conversation around these different elements of it.
Gotcha. So they've canceled twice. So we kind of got that in front of us. And you mentioned, there's a valid health reason that they missed a session. So I guess the question, for us, to kind of go back and forth on a little bit, is that, okay, session 3 has been no showed, and now session 4 has now been no showed as well. Whose responsibility? I guess from my ethical, I'm trying to think about this ethically, whose responsibility is it to reach out and make sure that the next session happens? So, they've missed 3. So, like, do I wait till session 4 and see if they're going to show up, or do I check in with them? Because to me, I feel like that's the person has a valid health reason, but whose responsibility is to intervene at this point? Is it more on the client's role to say something about it? Or as a clinician, should we be picking it up? Or is there a collaborative effort too?
I think, where the relationship stands, this is they've met for an intake and they've met for 1 session, it sounds like, because this is the 3rd and 4th session. So, at that point, there's not a whole lot of relationship built. This is still kind of an introductory relationship, still getting to know each other. And I would say that those responsibilities would probably lie with the clinician, that after that first no-show, that they should reach out and just inquire how things are going. I noticed you missed your appointment, wondering how you are. and definitely also after that fourth appointment. But after that, I would say then it lies on the client to be able to then communicate back if they would like to continue.
I gotcha. So first responsibility on me as a clinician after that first session, but after that second no show, we're going to, I guess I wouldn't use the word pressure, but the responsibility that now falls on the client at that point. Okay.
Personally, I would reach out both times. If we had a scheduled appointment, we both knew about it and they didn't show, even if we had two appointments that no showed both times, I would reach out both times. But after that, I would wait for the client to contact me again. And it sounds like they did, considering you find out that they did have these issues happening.
Yeah. And I know for me, if I'm thinking about this, if this is going on with me, I would definitely reach out after the session number 3 and say what happened and trying to figure out what's going on. And I think after session 4, I think that kind of getting back to the original problem we have here is like, I can see myself reaching out at that point, but then now the question becomes, okay, am I going to charge this no-show fee for them not coming? Or I think in my mind, I can justify for session number 3, hey, they have a medical illness. They weren't able to come in. We can just waive that one and talk through that one. But now we've got a second time in a row. I think for me personally, I will have a little bit more difficult time waiving a no-show fee the second time than I would the first time. But I'm kind of curious where you would be about that.
Well, the case study is not really clear about whether the client is missing the third and then communicating about why they missed, and then missing the fourth and then communicating. So it's not really clear if this is happening in between or if this is only happening after the fourth session. I think that is a question of, I think as a clinician would want to talk with the client to make sure that they were clear about what the policy was about no-shows, to find out what was happening, what kept them from communicating, what kept them from showing up. I would want to know those things before I felt like, okay, this is okay, because of like the way the case study is set up. They acknowledged in the very beginning that they have a chronic illness, and that they often have to go to the hospital and things like that. And so I would want to know that before I assumed anything.
Gotcha. Which I think that naturally takes us to the next question, or the next part of this, where we generate potential courses of action. That's number 4. And so I think we've already kind of have decided that a little bit. So on your end, you're saying, well, at least I'm make sure I'm not saying it incorrectly. You probably would. It's not like you wouldn't have charged for the second no-show, where I probably would. So we have some differences here, which I think is good. And so we have 2 clinicians. We're thinking about the case in some very similar ways, but now we have this kind of divergence here where one clinician is going to say, hey, I'm going to charge you a no-show for this last session. Another therapist is saying, I'm not going to. Let's talk through this. And so we've got these 2 different paths that we want to do. And so after we have kind of figured out our potential course of action, one of us charging, the other one not charging, then number 5, it talks about consider the potential consequences of all options and determine a course of action. So I guess I'll start on my part. If I think about some of the potential consequences from it, if I do charge them for that next no-show, but at the fourth session, it could be a thing where they may not return as a client because they may feel like that, okay, they have this health issue. They may view me as being misunderstanding or not compassionate enough. And so that could be a consequence that comes from me charging that no-show fee to the client. And so I have to consider that as a part of the process that, I could lose this client and not necessarily concerned about the financial piece of it, but just the fact that, okay, we've built rapport, we've started this relationship with each other therapeutically. And now because of this no-show fee, this could potentially be something that will have them step away from the counseling process. So that's definitely a consequence I would need to consider on my end. What about on your end? What do you think of some things you would need to consider if you didn't charge?
Well, I've kind of shifted my my thoughts around to like my plan of being pretty much having a conversation with them, making sure that they understand the policy, understand why the policy's there, and that we have an understanding of what will happen going forward, what that looks like, how much the cost would be, that kind of thing, and just, had an understanding. That kind of then leads me to the point where you are, though, because we can have the conversation, but I can't make this client do anything. They may show up for 5 more sessions and then no show 5 more. So I think that, it's really up to the client at that point. So the consequence would be that I would put the responsibility on them.
I like that. So just had to process that for a second. Now, I like this. So in this case, that now the decision process now kind of falls in their hands. And so at least from your perspective, you can maybe step back a little bit and let them kind of decide where they're going to go with it versus you trying to make a decision for them. At least that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah. I mean, allowing them to be accountable, but also, giving them flexibility. A lot of procedures about no-show appointments have, cancellation in 24 hours. There's no-show fee, something like that. And the communication is the original problem. And so, that addresses the communication piece of it. Now, if they go forward and they cancel, 2 hours before and they're not communicating, or, they're not saying what's happening, they're just something like that, that's, kind of puts me back to where you are in that, I have to kind of then just consider the consequence of this could rupture the relationship.
I gotcha. All right, so we know we're considered with number 5, we consider the potential consequences. And the number 6 says, evaluate the selected course of action. And so I think we kind of been talking that out already a little bit. It's like, so if I make this decision, this is the potential of where it can kind of go for me and for the client. And for me, I think that's always an interesting process to undergo as a clinician, is because I think we show up and we do our best to make decisions, ethical decisions, but like you're saying, at some point we have to step back and allow the client to be in control of their destiny of what's going to happen with them. And so there's only so much I can do on my end. So whether I charge a no-show fee or not, I mean, that's a question we have before us. But regardless of if I charge or don't charge it, there becomes a time where I have to make a decision, and then I have to basically wait and see, hey, how is the client going to respond to this? And I don't want to control that. I want them to be able to have that freedom to make a decision. Is this something I still want to be involved with? Do I want to go in a different direction? But I can't know that if I'm trying to make them make a decision for something that makes sense.
Yeah.
So, and then last talked about implementing the course of action. So then this is where we just get to the point where we make the decision that, hey, I'm going to implement and I'm going to move forward with the decision I have, and let's see what happens basically at that point. So I'm kind of curious on your end, when you find yourself in these scenarios, do you ever document your ethical decision making when you go through it, or how do you kind of go through it once you have those 7 points kind of laid out for you?
I think it's really important to document going through this process on the client's case, or if it has to do with things outside a client case, like a colleague or something like that, or, someone in the community. It's still important to document these things clinically. And being able to use the 7 steps is really helpful because, you can say I used ethical decision-making step, 3 or something like that. And this is my process. And it just gives you justification. It gives you backup for what you were thinking, why you were thinking that. It's really easy to go back to and say, okay, this is how I made the decision. This is why I made the decision. And it's a protective measure because, sometimes things don't go the way that we think they will. And so it can be really helpful to have that documentation, not just for yourself, but in case you should need to protect yourself.
And so being able to like document, like you said, document that, have those steps lined out, I think it is very helpful. And so I know with my students, that's one thing I want to kind of help them to kind of say, hey, if you're making this decision, be passionate about whatever you're going to do. That's fine. But there has to be something that that needs to be a trail of thought that says, okay, here's a decision I've made, and this is how I got to that decision. And for me, I feel like the ACA's ethical decision making model really makes it very practical and easy to kind of walk through that, document it, and then, like I said, if something does happen, we've got it right there, and there's no question in my mind about why I've made a decision. I think to me the concern that comes up sometimes with decision making models is with decision making in general is that we sometimes will go from our gut feeling or gut reaction, which the intuition in counseling is not necessarily a bad thing, which that also would be a very good topic to talk about at some point too. I don't think intuition is a bad thing, but using intuition with a decision-making model, to me, I think is a healthier and a safer way to kind of go about it versus just kind of jumping out there and making a decision without thinking through what can be the potential consequences of actions here.
Yeah. Well, I think it allows us, gives us that framework to really walk through the process of what it could look like from the information that we have instead of being reactive. Because, in clinical work, you can't really afford to be reactive in difficult decision making, whatever that may look like. You have to have, support behind you. If you need to talk to someone about it, it's really helpful to say, okay, this is my first step. I'm going to identify the problem. Now help me walk through this and identify all the problems. I only see this, but what do you see? And so I think it's really useful for things like supervision and, consulting with colleagues as well.
And I like how you talk about not being reactive in situations. This helps us, like I said, this helps us to slow down quite a bit, because if I have to think through this decision I'm about to make, and I'm committing to this decision, how did I get here? And I think that helps quite a bit in the long run of organizing thoughts and organizing our decision making. And just having it out there. So yeah, to me, I'm thankful that we have this decision making model that we can use when cases come up. And I'm hoping that it's not just something people use in grad school with students, that we keep using it after the fact, because codes change, life changes, and people change. And so when we see all those changes occurring, we have to know, at least from my perspective, we need to know how did I get here? And I think the more comfortable we can get with showing how we got from point A to point B, decision making wise, it just helps the process out. And I feel, at least personally, I feel a lot more confident in my decision making skills and as a therapist, because if I'm ever asked a question, I can always go back and show this is how I got there. So to me, I like having that guidance there.
Yeah. And I think it's a really important tool for especially like new LACs going out into the field, because, you're under supervision. You do have that person that you can consult with pretty regularly, but as an LAC, you're new and every experience is new. And even if it's not an issue, even if there's not a problem, you may have, like you said, that kind of gut intuition about it. So following the process really gives you, a substantial tool to use when you can't access a colleague or a supervisor or somebody else to talk things through with. It allows you to have, some of your own insight into building those frameworks for yourself.
Gotcha. I think you summarized it up pretty well about saying that. Appreciate you having this conversation with me today. It's fun thinking through the whys of counseling. And so I appreciate you working with me today as we're trying to kind of talk about an ethical decision-making model. And I hope this video will be helpful for anybody that's looking at, okay, how do we have that process? And I know there's multiple decision-making models out there, but just for the purpose of this video, we thought ACA would be a good one to start with. So hopefully this was helpful, and we'll see y'all again soon on another episode of Ethics Shorts. Y'all take care.